Today's daf we're going to be learning is Chullin daf nun gimel. Today is a bit of an easier daf. We're going to continue completely with the topic of derisa with a bit of a tangent at the very end, which we'll explain why we get there when we get there. But we're going to continue. We ended yesterday. We started with derisa as a ev. If you remember, we saw in the Mishna, just to do a quick review, that Rabbi Yehuda said, right? They said derisa as a ev b'beima, a wolf creates a derisa situation in an animal. Came Rabbi Yehuda and said, in a small animal, the ze'ev, right? The wolf is in a small animal, but in a large animal, it's a lion. And then he went in to define in a large bird, it's the derusat hagas, and in a small bird, it's the netz, it's the hawk. Okay, now, we saw yesterday there was a machloket about a few things. Number one, we saw there was a machloket about whether Rabbi Yehuda disagrees with the rabbis, or the rabbis disagree with Rabbi Yehuda, or Rabbi Yehuda is actually just coming to explain the rabbis. And when the rabbis said derisa is the ev, what they meant is in a small animal, but in a large animal, a lion, and so on. So there was two ways of reading the Mishnah. Then we had this halach of Rav Chisda about a chatul and an imiyah, right? That a chatul, a cat, and a mongoose create a treifa in small animals, right? In other words, among the behemoth takot, there's the smaller among them, the very young, and those can be attacked by a cat. We said that seemed to contradict this other source that said no. And then we distinguished between, right, we said either it's Baribi's opinion and whether there's Mitzilim or a Mitzilim. Okay, I'm not going to get into all that, but that's basically, we have this idea that there are some cases where a cat can actually create a derisa situation. So remember, just one last reminder, what is derisa? It's when an animal claws another animal and puts its venom into that animal. Okay, so we're going to learn all about it today. First, we're going to have a series of 3 questions that Rav Kahana asked Rav on different occasions, and each time got a completely different answer. And then we're going to explain that each time he must have asked the question about a different situation. And I'm telling you this because otherwise when we read it, it's going to sound completely confusing. But then you'll realize, we'll quickly explain it, but don't get confused from the get-go. By mine Rav Kahana mi Rav. So, very last words of Nun Bet and Mebet. Rav Kahana asked Rav the following question. Yesh derisa l'chatul or ein derisa l'chatul? Is there a concept of clawing that will cause the animal to be a treifa by a cat or not? Amar le, af lechulda yesh derisa. Even for a weasel, there's derisa. So, of course, for a cat. Okay, second time he asked him the question. This time he asked him not about a cat, but about a weasel. Yesh derisa l'chulda or ein derisa l'chulda? Is there derisa for a weasel? Can a weasel create a derisa situation? Claws with poison that will cause the animal to become a treifa? Amarle, af l'chatul ein derisa. Of course there's no derisa for a weasel, because even for a cat that's bigger or more likely to be dangerous with its poison than the chatul, right? Than the chulda, than the weasel. So of course not. Okay, so this is strange. The first time he said, right, there's even for a weasel. This time he said there isn't even for a cat. Then another time he asked him, Lechatul ulechulda yesh lahem derisa or ein lahem derisa. He asked specifically about both a cat and a weasel. And what was the answer? Amarle, right, until now we had either they both create derisa situations or neither one does. And now he says, Lechatul yesh derisa, lechulda ein derisa. And here he says we distinguish between the two. Okay, they don't go together, so we have all 3 possibilities, right? So what does this mean? Velo kashya. Hada amar le af lechulda yesh derisa, when he said both the cat and the weasel create a derisa situation, be'ofot, that it depends what you're attacking. If they attack birds, they create a derisa situation, because cats and weasels can attack birds with their venom and it will kill the bird, ultimately. Hada amar le af lechatul ein derisa, when he said neither of them, even the cat doesn't have derisa, be'imre ravrave, that's in big sheep. Because we said, right, of the small animals, but the big ones among the small animals, even the cat doesn't create a derisa situation, obviously not the weasel. And in the case where he distinguishes is exactly what we saw yesterday. Bigdiim utzlaim, in the very small, the baby goats and the baby sheep or lambs. Okay, so in those, the cat creates a derisa situation, whereas the weasel does not. Okay, so something that looked very confusing in the end is actually very organized. Okay, by Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi now asks, we're going to have 2 more questions about do certain animals create derisa situations. Shar ofot me'in yesh lahem drusa, ein lahem drusa. Now the Mishnah mentioned the hawk and this large bird, okay, which didn't exactly specify what it is, but a large bird. What about the rest of the non-kosher and birds? Now the non-kosher birds are generally predatory birds. It's one of the simanim, right? The signs for a non-kosher bird. So, do they have drusa? Ein lahem drusa. Since they're predatory birds, do we assume that if they claw another bird, it creates a treifa or not? Amar lahem Rav Hillel Rav Ashi. So Rav Hillel answers Rav Ashi and says, Ki avina be Rav Kahana. And he says, listen, when I was studying with Rav Kahana, Amal, he said, Shar ofot me'im yesh lahem drusa. He said, yeah, they do. They create drusa situations where, again, if they claw a bird, the bird will be a treifa. To which he asks, the Rav Ashi asked him, doesn't it say in the Mishnah, drusat hanetz ba'ofadak, period. Drusat hanetz ba'ofadak, right? Doesn't it say it's the hawk that creates a drusa situation, not other birds, right? It seems to exclude other birds. So what's he going to explain? It excludes them in a particular way. In other words, there's one way that with the drusat hanetz, with a hawk, the clause is going to be more severe, okay, or more encompassing. How so? So we're going to have two versions of this. Today we're going to have a lot of two versions of the same kind of thing. Drusat hanetz b'dekavate v'inach b'dezutra minayu. Okay, what does this mean? Drusat hanetz can create a drusa situation and make the bird a treifa in animals that are dekavate. Dekavate means kmotam, like them. So a hawk to another bird that's the same size as it. That can create a drusa situation, and obviously smaller birds, not larger than it, but itself and smaller. The inach and the other is b'dezutra minayu. Only any other non-kosher bird that's predatory, they can claw, and we'll say the bird's a treifa, but only if it's smaller, not if it's the same size. And that's what the Mishnah is highlighting here, that the hawk can even make a treifa in a bird, that is the same size. Ika de Amre, some people say, they go up a level, and what do they say? Drusat hanetz b'derav ravemine. The drusa of a netz could even be, a hawk can even create a drusa in a larger than the hawk's size bird, okay? It came out sounding confusing. In a bird that's larger than the size of the hawk, whereas inach, all the others, bidkavatayu, in birds that are the same size as them. So either which way, it goes up a level, okay, either to birds the same size as it or to birds larger than it, okay? And the rest of them are one step below. Amar Rav Kahana Mishmei Rav Shimi bar Ashi. Ein drusa l'shu'al. Okay, this time we're gonna have two versions of what he said. So the first version is that Rav Kahana said in the name of Rav Shimi bar Ashi, there's no drusa for a fox. A fox does not create a drusa situation. It claws an animal. Okay, there's no treifa here. Ini, is this really true? Vaha ki ata Rav Dimi. We're now going to have a story. When Rav Dimi came, Amar ma'aseh v'darash shu'al Rachel b'merchat shel Beit Hini. Okay, there was a case that happened in the bathhouse of Beit Hini, and a fox came and attacked a Rachel. That's a type of sheep. Uba ma'aseh l'fnei chachamim. Case came before the rabbis. V'amru yesh drusa. They said, this fox attacked the sheep. It created a drusa situation. So how could you say there's no drusa for shu'al? The rabbi said so. Amar Rav Safra, ha'i chatul hava. You got the facts wrong. It wasn't a fox, it was a cat. And it must have been a small sheep. So, like we said, the chatul creates a drusa, right, a treifa situation in a small sheep. Okay, so we had the psak, no drusa. We asked a question from the story. We shifted the detail of the story to make it fit, with what we said. You got the facts wrong. Okay, but now we're going to have a different version where everything is flipped. Even the details of the story are flipped, and also what he said was flipped, and the response is different. So how is it flipped? Well, instead of saying there isn't drusa for a fox does create a situation where if it claws another animal, it will be a treifa. Ini, is this really true? But the hakiata, now the people are all going to be the same. Hakiata Rav Dimi, when Rav Dimi came, he said, remember, Rav Dimi lived in Israel. When he came from Israel, he told this story. What was the story? Okay, so there was this case, exactly the same thing, where the fox attacked a Rachel in this Beit Merachatz. Ubama lifnei chachamim. The case came before the rabbis. Va'amru. Now here it's going to be the exact opposite. What did the rabbis say? Ein derisa. Okay, there's no derisa problem here. Okay. So now, how do we explain then there is derisa when they ruled there wasn't derisa? So Amar of Safra, now instead of changing it to a cat, which won't help us, they're going to change it to a dog, because there's no derisa by a dog. Amar of Safra, kelev have. It was a dog, and that's why there was no derisa in that situation. Amar of Yosef, naktinan ein derisa lekelev. And in case you didn't know that, Rav Yosef tells us we have a tradition that there's no derisa for a dog, and that's why they claim the story happened with a dog, and that's why it wasn't a treifa. But if it really was a fox, it would have created a treifa situation, because a fox with claws does create a treifa. So now we have different opinion about what the same person actually said, whether they said itself or the opposite. And now comes Abaye, and Abaye says, I'm going to tell you a bunch of details about derisa, that it's only going to be in certain situations. You need certain things to happen in order for it to be derisa. So he's limiting. Naktinan, naktinan usually means I was taught. Okay, I have a tradition. Ein derisa ela biyad, la'afuke regel delo. Each time he's going to say it's only this, and to exclude that. It's only with the hands, meaning, right, they only claw with their front paws, not their back. Okay, with the front paws, not the back paws, or claws. Ein derisa ela b'tziporen, only with the nails, right, the claws. La'afuke shein delo. It's not by biting. Right? You think of a dog and rabies, right? That kind of thing. So it's not by biting, it's only by clawing. Ein derisa ela midat, la'afuke shelo midat delo. Okay, this connects with that story about the cat yesterday. That they only do it with intent. If, let's say, an animal got thrown on top of another one and clawed it on the way, got scratched by accident, right? Something like that happens. You brush past someone, you accidentally scratch them, right? If the scratch happened by accident, the clawing, that's not, the venom doesn't come out. There has to be intent for attack. That creates the venom, right? It gets the venom out only when the bird or animal attacks. So there's no derisa if it was not with intent, which then makes this last one very strange, and the Gemara is going to ask, ein derisa ela mechayim, only if the predatory is still alive, lafuke lachar mita delo. If it claws after death, it's not going to be a problem. Okay, that's a little strange. First of all, what animal is clawing after death? And what the Gemara is going to ask right now is, Amrei hashta shelo midad amart lo. If you say without intent there's no clawing, la'achar mita mebaya, why are you going to ask after death? Obviously there was no intent if the animal's already dead. So that last one doesn't make any sense, and now they're going to explain it. And this is now you're going to shift a little bit what derisa is. Lo tzricha didaris upasku eliyade. Let's say the animal clawed it while it was still alive with intent. And then they cut off its hands and the animal was killed. Okay, the animal dies before it takes its claws out of the other animal. So ma'u detema, you might have thought, bahade didaris shade zihara, that the venom comes out when it claws. That's what you would have thought, right? It attacks and the claws have venom and it goes into the body of the other animal. But now they're going to say no. The animal has to be alive at what stage? When it pulls out the claws. Because kamashman, this comes to teach you when it says only when it's alive and not after death, bahade de shalif shade zire. The venom comes out actually as the animal removes its claws from the other animal. Okay? So if it does it with intent, but then is killed before it removes its claws, then there's not going to be any venom in the animal. Okay? So that's the fourth thing that Abaye limits this to. So let's just review. Only the front legs, the front claws, only claws and not teeth, only with intent, and only when it's still alive at the end of the process. Amar Rabba bar Rav Huna Amar Rav. Now we're going to start with our safek cases. We have a case where we're going to find a lion among oxen. Okay, Amar Rav, Arisha, so Rabba bar Rav Huna says in the name of Rav, Arisha nechnas leben hashvarim. So we have a lion who comes into a den, let's say, with oxen. Okay, this is like a detective situation. We find, so we look at the situation after, we see they were all together, and we find a nail in the back of one of the oxen. So comes Rav and he says, we're not concerned that the nail came from the lion, and the lion clawed the ox. and we can eat the ox. Okay, we can slaughter it and eat it. It's not a treifa. My taima, what's Rav's reason? Rov arayot dorsim umiyutan ein dorsim. Now we start to get into rov and miyut, and what do we assume the majority do? So the majority, let's say it like this. While the majority of lions are predatory and will claw the oxen, and only a minority don't, but there is a minority that don't. But we also know that generally when an animal claws another animal, generally the nail doesn't fall off. So the fact that we have a nail, so we have, on the one hand, we have a lion among oxen, and likely he was derisa. On the other hand, the nail stuck in the back of the ox is not really an indicator that it was clawed because the claws don't usually fall off. So now how do we explain then that there's a nail in the back of this ox? Well, oxen, if they want to scratch themselves, right, they can't take their hands, right? It's hard enough for us to take our hands and scratch our back, but it's even harder for an animal. So what does an animal do? It often rubs up against walls. So that's very common. And it could be there was a nail stuck in the wall from somewhere. So when it rubbed up against the wall, it ended up with the nail sticking into its body. And that's more likely where the nail came from, in which case we don't think it's a derisa. To which the Gemara says, Adrabah, we could say the exact reverse to what Rav said. Now, while it's true that most of them rub up against walls and only a minority of them don't rub up against walls, but if it normally rubs up against a wall, against a nail, it's not really going to usually stick into its body and stay there. So what's the only reason why it could have a nail stuck in its back? We can assume it was because a lion attacked it and the nail got stuck inside. So this kind of takes the opposite logic, that it's much more likely, it might be more likely that they rubbed up against the wall, but it's unlikely that the nail got stuck in them for that reason, and therefore we can assume it must be from the lion. To which the Gemara explains, why did Rav not say that? Because in the end, you could claim what Rav claimed. You could claim what the Gemara counterclaimed, right? Both are possibilities, right? It could be it came from the lion. It could be it came from the wall. So what do you do when you have a suffix like that? Okay, milta achezke. Well, let's go back to the presumed, what was the presumption of its status, the presumptive status beforehand? It was nothing, right? It wasn't derisa. It was just an ox walking on the street, right? Or wherever it was. So, since its presumptive status was kosher, havale suffix drusa, and this is just a suffix, maybe it's a drusa, maybe it wasn't, we don't know. You could say 50-50, right? We don't know exactly. So, now, okay, what's the law of a suffix drusa? Well, we're going to see it's a machloka Rav and Shmuel. But Rav is going to go l'ta'ameh. This was all Rav. This was a quote of what Rav held. So Rav l'ta'ameh, Rav is consistent with his opinion, ta'amar, in chosheshin the suffix drusa. He says we don't have to worry about suffix drusas. So that's why he said that since it could go this way, could go that way, and anyway, the presumptive status was already kosher, so we're just going to continue that presumptive status, and we're not going to be stringent here at all. Okay, that's Rav. We're going to get back to this machloka Rav and Shmuel in a minute, but first Abaye is going to pipe in again. Now Abaye is going to talk about this situation where you have a nail in the back of the ox, and do you have to worry or not worry? So Amar Abaye. Now when we said you don't have to worry, because Rav says you don't have to be concerned, so now Abaye is going to limit that. Okay, before he limited when is it actually a problem, and now he's going to limit when is it not a problem. Okay, so he's going to say Lo maran elet tziporen, aval makon tziporen chosheshin. The whole thing here was that it's unlikely, this is what Rav said, that the nail came off the lion. So if there's an actual nail there, Rav didn't think it came from the lion, you don't have to worry about it. But if there's no nail there and there's just a nail indentation, I think of like kids when they're little and they're in nursery school, and they come home with all these bite marks and other things, right, from other kids. Right? So there's this indentation from a nail. Well, then you can assume it was the lion, because the whole reason we didn't think it was the lion is because the nails don't usually fall off when they're in the process of clawing. But if there's just there's a lion in the scene and there's a nail indentation mark, likely it's from the lion. And when we said there was a nail there, and we're not concerned it came from the lion, that's only when it's moist. But if it's a dried nail, And let's say this lion had a completely dried nail. Well, we know that nails that dry completely, right, a claw that dried, avida de mishtamta, it's likely to come off, right, detach. So if it was this dried out claw that's in the body of the ox, we can assume it came from the lion. Now, even when it's moist, and we say, well, then it's really not an issue because it's not going to come off, lo maran elachada. We're only talking about if you see one nail. And if there's 2 or 3 we're concerned, but only in the case that if we see 2 or 3 in a line, in a row, okay, if we have 2 or 3 random spots on the back of the ox, we can assume it was from the wall, because if a lion attacked it, it didn't attack it there, there, and there, and end up with the 3 nails coming out. But if the lion attacked it and you see 3 nails in a row, that's much more likely that it came from the lion. It would be very odd to think that if you rub it up against a wall, the 3 nails are going to come out exactly in a row on that back of the ox. So again, this is like detective work. It depends how you find it, what you find, whether you can assume it came from the lion or it didn't come from the lion. Okay, now we're going to get back to this machloket Rav and Shmuel. So again, that was all because we talked about Rav, who said we're not worried when there's a lion among the oxen and there's a nail in the back of the oxen. Abaye came and tempered it a little bit and said, well, some cases we will be worried. Now comes the machloket. Itmar. Rav Amar ein chosheshin l'safek drusa, u'Shmuel Amar chosheshin l'safek drusa. Okay, Rav says we're not concerned if there's a safek drusa case. We just rule leniently, and you can eat the animal without anything. Shmuel says we're concerned. Now later we'll see that when he says we're concerned, what it means is it's not that you have to be stringent and say the animal's a treifa, but after you slaughter the animal, you have to check. You have to look at the animal and check the situation. Or we can assume it's a suffix, and we're going to see Shmuel in a particular case does throw them out. Okay, but there is a possible way to permit it. If you want to permit a suffix drusa, according to Shmuel, we're going to see at the end of the daf what you can do to check. But right now, let's just assume he means suffix drusa is a treifa. So dekule alma, now we're going to say, well, in what case do they really disagree? And we're going to list a whole bunch of cases they both agree, and then only get to one case where they disagree. So again, we're talking about lion among oxen as our example. Suffix, now there's all kinds of sveikot that could be. So dekule alma, everyone agrees. Suffix al, suffix lo al. If we're not sure if the lion even went into the area where the oxen were, or didn't go in there, for sure that's not a problem. Ema lo al. We'll just assume it didn't go in. But this is where we talk about what in Hebrew or in Aramaic, in the Gemara language, we're going to call it tolin. We leave it hanging, meaning we can hang it to we can assume it came from something else. Okay, we can hang the issue on something else. So we can just assume it didn't go in. Safek kalba, safek shunra, okay, this you know from Chagadya, right? Is it a dog or is it a cat? Now a cat creates a problem with little animals, whereas a dog doesn't create any problem. So if there was a little animal, right, like a gedi, that a baby goat, okay, apropos Chagadya, okay, so there was a gedi, a goat, that was attacked by either a cat or a dog, and you're not sure which one. Ema kalba, again, we use this law of tolin. We can assume it was a dog and go leniently. Even Shmuel agrees with that. Al shatik v'ito benayu, if the lion went in among the oxen and was silent and everything was quiet, emer shlama shavi, we assume it came in peace, nothing happened. Kata reshe dechad minayu, if it cut off the head of one of them, nachmi ritche, we assume it got out its anger on chopping off the head of this ox, or cutting, I don't know exactly how it cuts off the head, but somehow cut off the head of the ox, and that's it. And we assume it didn't do more damage than that. Okay. Iyu kama Abaye v'inu kama karkaran. If the lion is making loud noises and the oxen are literally, it means clucking, like lekarker is to cluck. Okay, they're making these clucking noises. Bi'ute kamivate ahadade. We assume that they're each scared of the other. The noise is a fear, a sign of fear, which means, again, there's no suffix drusa, because we don't assume that the lion attacked. If the lion's making all these noises, the lion's obviously scared as well. Okay, so top of Amubet now, ki pligi, the machloket is, di'iu kashatik ve'inu kamakarkaran. The only case they have a debate is when the lion is quiet and the oxen are clucking. Mar savar maase ka'avibihu. So, one says, right, that's Shmuel, they must have done something, okay? The lion must have attacked, and that's why the lion's quiet, and that's why they're screaming, basically. Umar Safar, Machmat Biatute Utakavda. No, they're just scared. Rav says they're just scared of the lion. It doesn't necessarily mean the lion did anything. And that's a case of Safek Drusa, where they have a machloket. Amar Amemar. Hilchata Chosheshin L'Safek Drusa. So Amemar says the halacha is like Shmuel, okay, which is a little bit strange because there's rules about when we paskin like Rav, when we paskin like Shmuel, and generally in Isser Beheter, which is what this is, right? Kosher, not kosher, we paskin like Rav usually. And when it's mamono, money issues, we paskin like Shmuel. This is not a monetary issue. This is a Isser Beheter. Is it kosher? Is it not kosher? So anyway, Amemar says the halacha is we're concerned for a Safek Drusa, and we're going to assume it's a treifa unless you can prove otherwise. Amalei Rav Ashi la Amemar. Had de Rav Mai. So Rav Ashi asked Amemar, what did you do with Rav's opinion? How'd you just ignore it, right? What about Rav? Amalei lo shmi'alei, klomar lo sfirali. Says, I didn't hear his opinion, which really means I don't hold by his opinion. Okay, it wasn't a great answer. He didn't really answer why. He just says, I don't hold by Rav. But here's a second answer. I told you we have a lot of second Gerso today, different versions. Ibait Ema, alternatively, his answer was Hadr be Rav legabe de Shmuel. Rav himself changed his mind and agreed with Shmuel in the end. Okay, now you can't just say this unless you have proof. So they're going to prove it from a story. Da'hu sharkafa, de safek druso, da'ata lekamei de Rav. There was a case of sharkafa. What's sharkafa? It was a basket full of birds that were all safek druso. Okay, so there were all these birds that there was a concern that they were attacked. Came before Rav. What did he do? Now, if you were Rav and you say safek drusa is okay, you would have just permitted it. But instead, no, he didn't forbid it. What did he do? He does something a little bit strange, which the Gemara is going to jump on and say, why did he do this? Shadrinu lekame de Shmuel. He gave them to Shmuel. Okay, he didn't rule on them himself. He gave them to Shmuel. Now, he knew what Shmuel was going to do with them because he knew that Shmuel disagreed with him. So we assume the fact that Rav gave it to Shmuel, he must have held that stuff. He must have changed his mind and agreed with Shmuel. We're going to have a lot of questions on this story in a minute. What did Shmuel do? Chankinu v'shadinu benara. He strangles each one of them and he throws them in the river. Okay, sounds a little bit brutal. Okay, so now we're going to say Isa kadatach. So first we're explaining why we brought this. Isa kadatach lo hadrabe. If he hadn't, this I already explained, but if he hadn't changed his mind and held the Safek Drusa was okay, lishrinu, he should have just permitted them. So now they say, okay, wait, we don't get it though. Elamai hadrabe lisrinu. If he had just agreed with Shmuel and said it's a problem, he should have forbade them himself. Why did he give them to Shmuel? Ela atre de Shmuel hava. He was in the place where Shmuel lived, and because of that, he let Shmuel paskin. Now, this is just interesting in and of itself because Rav was a bigger Talmid Chacham than Shmuel at the time. Shmuel only steps into Rav's shoes once Rav dies. Shmuel was, big in his own right, but Rav clearly was a much more respected rabbi than Shmuel. And in the end, Shmuel ends up, Rav ends up respecting Shmuel because he was in the city where Shmuel lived. And then he said, okay, well, I'm not going to step on his toes. I'm not going to rule in his town. Now, if he had disagreed with him, then it makes sense he would have ruled against Shmuel. But he conceded to him and then let Shmuel do the job of forbidding it. Okay, he didn't forbid it himself. So that explains why he didn't forbid it himself. But now we have to explain Shmuel's. Why did Shmuel strangle them? Lishtinu hachi benara. Why didn't he just throw them as is in the river? It would have been a lot less brutal if he had just thrown them in the river. Well, that's obvious why he didn't do that, because mifracham v'salkan, they would have flown away, right, and gone up. They would have, been let loose. And then what will happen? They'll go fly around. Someone else will catch them and eat them, not realizing that they're a Safek Drusa. It's not like it has a sign on it that says, I'm a Safek Drusa. So we didn't want them flying around that people would accidentally eat them. Okay, well now they say, but there's a lot of better solutions than strangling them. Lishinu 12 chodesh. Put them in a cage and leave them for 12 months and see if they still live, because it's only a Safek Drusa, then they weren't clawed because it's still alive. Remember, that's the whole, at least the main definition of treifa, even though some think otherwise, but it's going to die within 12 months. He was worried that if you have these birds in a cage, somebody might come and take one and kill it, right, to eat. Okay, why don't you let them sell it to non-Jews? Well, Ati Lizbenu Ali Israel. Okay, there were a lot of Jews who bought from non-Jews, especially if it was a town that was, most of the slaughterers were kosher slaughterers. You can rely on Rov that it's okay to eat them. And, okay, this is a sugya we're going to get to much later, but basically, the Jews might end up buying it and not knowing that it's a safek derisa. Okay, so we get it that he had to kill them. Okay, but then lichnikinu, let him strangle them, but lishtinu la'ashba. Why did he throw them in the river? He could have just thrown them in the garbage. So to answer this question, they come up with a counter question, and with this we'll end the section. He could have also given it to dogs to eat. Why do you have to send it in the river where it was really went to waste? Lipersume milta di isura. He wanted to let everybody know that this was forbidden. He wanted to publicize it. So he did it down by the river, where a lot of people are found down by the river, getting water, washing themselves. It was a very public place. If you had just thrown it in the garbage, that wouldn't have worked. Okay? So, or given it to his dogs to eat. So that's why Shmuel did it in this way. Okay? And with that, we end with, right, we have Rav and Shmuel and Machloket. In many cases, they agree. Like, for example, is it a dog or is it a cat? We can assume it was a dog, but in that one case we had where the lion was quiet, the shvarim were making noises, the oxen, and there they have a machloket, but then a meimer paskins like Shmuel, and we say either he just doesn't hold like Rav, or perhaps Rav changed his mind, and we prove from the story, looks like Rav changed his mind, otherwise he wouldn't have given it to Shmuel to kill all these birds. Now we're going to have another case. Hahu avza, dahavibe Rav Ashi. Okay, there was a duck that went, or a goose that was in the house of Rav Ashi. Alabene kanya, it went among reeds, which could scratch you and create a bloody situation. Nafik ata, when it went out of that area, ki memasmes koedama, its neck was full of blood. Amar Rav Ashi, lo marina safek kalba safek shunra imar kalba. Do we not say that when there's a suffix, was it a dog or was it a cat? We assume it was a dog and it wasn't a problem. Hachanami suffix kanya suffix shunra emar kanya machye. Here, what was the issue? The goose went in to the area where there were all these reeds, comes out all bloody. It could have been attacked by the reeds, scratched up, or it could have been attacked by a cat. So he says if it's a suffix dog cat, everyone agrees, even Shmuel agrees, that we're going to assume it was a dog. So here we can assume it was the reeds. If we have something else to assume that it happened from, then it's fine. And that's why Rav Ashi said this wasn't a problem. Okay, now we're going to start the last section of today's daf, which we're going to have a whole series of things. Some of them relate to derisa, some of them don't, but they're all going to end up with the same kind of structure or similar. Okay, so you'll see in a minute. Amrei b'nei Rabbi Chia. So the sons of Rabbi Chia say, and obviously the first one is going to have to do with the drusa. Drusa shamru tzricha b'dika keneged b'nei me'ayim. And now we're going to end with this issue that I mentioned earlier, which is if you have a safek drusa case, so you can check after you slaughter the animal, check the insides. What do you check? You check the area opposite the intestines, and if it's red, we're going to see that later. It doesn't say it here, but we're going to see it later. If it's red, then it's a sign that the poison got in and it made the whole area red. Okay? So that's the concern. So if you check and it's not red, then you can actually permit it even according to Shmuel. That's what the Bnei Rabbi Chia say. So Amar Rav Yosef, and this is going to be the running theme, this type of response to somebody's something. Okay, later it's going to be questions. This time it was a statement somebody made. Comes Rav Yosef and says, "Hat Bnei Rabbi Chia kvar pirsha Shmuel." What these Bnei Rabbi Chia said is if they came up with this, Shmuel said it before them. Da'amar Shmuel, Mishum Rabbi Chanina ben Antukinus, Drusa Shamru, Tzricha B'dika Keneged B'nei Me'ayim. Okay, when we talk about this Drusa, which we assume means a suffix Drusa, you have to check it Keneged B'nei Me'ayim. So Shmuel himself, who was ruling stringently on a suffix Drusa, says, but you can check it inside. And if it's not red, then you can permit it. So there is a way to permit. Tosfot actually claims that this isn't even talking about a suffix Drusa. Even in an actual Drusa, you can check. In other words, when you know it was clawed, you can still open up inside because maybe the venom didn't get in. And then there's this machloket about whether you can even check in a drusa case, or once it's drusa and you know for sure it was clawed, maybe you can't check. Okay, so there's a machloket among the Rishonim about what this is referring to. Is it only in a suffix case or is it also in a definitive case? Okay, now, because we had this statement of Bnei Rabbi Chia, and the response of Rabbi Yosef was, why are you saying that? Someone else already said it. Now we're going to have a slew of questions. The first two are Ilfa, then Rabbi Ami, who are going to ask questions, and then the answer is going to be, oh, someone already said this. Okay, so it's a little different because before it was you're making this statement and someone already said it, but now we're going to have it more like a question, and then, oh, your answer was given by somebody else. And like I said, some have to do with drusa, some don't. By Ilfa. Ilfa asked the following question. Yesh drusa l'simanim or ain't drusa l'simanim? If you're concerned the poison got into the simanim, is like the poison going to ruin the simanim? What are the simanim? The kanen, the veshet, the windpipe, and the gullet. Are we concerned that the venom will get into them or not? Amar Rabbi Zera, had by Ilfa. What Ilfa asked, far persha Rav Kahana bar Rabba. Rav Kahana bar Rabba already said this before him. To Amar Rav Kahana bar Rabba Amar Rav, he said the name of Rav, drusa shamru tzricha b'dika keneged beit hachalal kulo. Va'afilu b'simanim. Okay, the drusa that we're talking about needs a b'dika on the whole internal organs of the animal, including the two simanim, the windpipe and the gullet. Okay, what does it exclude? The legs, the arms, those parts. But the inner part of the body and the torso, everything has to be checked. So obviously then there's drusa for simanim. By Ilfa. Ilfa asked, simanim, now this has to do with simanim, it doesn't have to do with drusa. Simanim shenidaldalu. If the simanim became detached, bikama. How much of them needs to be detached for it to be considered, detached from the jawbone, for it to be considered a problem, right, a treifa. Amar Rabbi Zera, had to buy Ilfa for Pirsha, Rabba Kahana. Rabba Kahana already explained this, as we're going to see in the name of Shmuel. To Amar Rabba Kahana Amar Shmuel, simanim shenidaldalu biruban. The majority of them are, if it's detached in the more places than it's attached, it's going to be a problem. By Rav Ami. Rav Ami asks, Hamas mesamahu. What if it's crushed? Amar Rabbi Zera, had to buy Rav Ami for Pirsha Rav Yehuda. To Amar Rav Yehuda. Okay, now we're going to quote this statement of Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. That's going to relate to himas masa or nitmas masa, and it's going to relate to drusa. So the answer here, the first part has nothing to do with the question. Bidrusa Ashi adim basar keneged b'nei me'ayim, which relates to what we saw before. In a drusa, you have to check the innards, right, opposite the intestines, to see if it's all red. If it's red inside, it's a sign of drusa. Nitmas mesa basal. Lo inoto ki'ilu eno. If it's nitmas mes, if it gets kind of crushed, then we're going to say we look at it as if it's not there. In other words, thank you for the word. I was struggling with the word decayed. If it rots inside, okay, this part of the body that's rotten, we look at it as if it's not there at all. Okay, we view it as if it's just non-existent. And then, right, we have all these things that we saw on the list of treifot. If it's nitla and it's not there, then it's a problem. Okay, or nitla berubo, right? The majority of it is missing, then it's a problem. Okay, so we view this as if it's not there anymore if it gets decayed. So what exactly does this mean? Like at what stage decayed could be a little decayed, a lot decayed? What makes it considered decayed? So, Amar Rav Huna bereid Rav Yoshua. Remember, this is who says it, because in a minute we're going to quote him again. Amar Rav Huna bereid Rav Yoshua. Kosha rofei goldo umamido basar chai. If you would go to a doctor, they would completely scrape it away and get to until the flesh is healthy. So any part that was decayed, they would just scoop right out. If it would be scooped out by a doctor, then it's as if it's not there. Okay, that's because basically it's dead. Amar Rav Ashi. So now we have a story. Kevina be Rav Kahana. We were before Rav Kahana. He brought a lung in front of us. This is going to be an example of it. Masmasa. So they brought a lung. While it was sitting, it sat and it was fine. So they took it out of the animal, they sat it down, it was completely intact. But as soon as we picked it up, the whole thing started coming apart and it fell into pieces. It broke into pieces. That's why I said, remember him? Based on what Rav Huna bereid Rav Yoshua said, which is if a rofei would come and scoop it all out, right, and scrape it out, then basically that's the same, and that's like this, where the whole lung just completely disintegrated. That obviously is a problem. Rav Nachman Amar, Bekotz ad tinakev l'chalal. Okay, the reason why we're having this is Rav Nachman makes a statement, and this is going to have to do, we finished our stories of our slew of cases of, somebody said something or somebody asked something, and then they said, oh, someone already answered your question. Okay, now we're going back to this test that you could do for a drusa, and with this we're going to finish up. And again, we're going to have two versions of this. So the first is Rav Nachman said, because this doesn't have to do with anything. There's another treifa. If there's a kotz in an animal, ad shina kev l'chalal, it has to have created a hole in some internal organ. Bidrusa mishayadim basar keneged b'nei me'ayim. And in a drusa, what's the sign? Where it's red, right, opposite the intestines. Rav Zvid matnehachi, but Rav Zvid had a different version of this statement, and it didn't have anything to do with the kotz. Okay, we're going to see right now. We're going to have two things about a drusa. Bidrusa mishayadim basar keneged b'nei me'ayim. So that has the second statement first, same thing. When it's red opposite the intestines. B'simanim, but if it's in the kanen, the veshet, the gullet and the windpipe and the gullet, ad shiadimu simanim atzmam. There it has to be not red opposite them, but they themselves turn red. If the simanim turn completely red, then it's a sign that the venom got in there. Okay, so we ended with these. How do you know if it's a drusa, or when it's a safek drusa, how do you tell that it's a drusa? You check either both the simanim and opposite the intestines, and if there's red opposite the intestines or the windpipe and gullet turn red, then it's a problem. Okay, let's review our daf. So we started with, is there drusa in a cat and a weasel? Is there drusa in other non-kosher birds? And is there drusa in a fox? Okay, so we saw different, right, with the cat and the weasel. It depends on to who. On the other birds, yes, but a little bit different than the hawk. Okay, they're one level below, which we saw two versions. And in the fox, we saw two different versions. It said the complete opposite answer. Then we got to Abaye, who limited, right, when it's going to be a drusa. He says only with the hand and with intent and all those. Then we had the Rav, who paskin with this lion that was among the oxen, and the nail was on the back of the ox, and he was lenient. And then we said Rav is lenient because he holds we're not worried about safek drusa, which led us to the machloket he had with Shmuel about a safek drusa, where Shmuel was more machmir. We had all the cases they agree, all the cases they disagree. We also had Abaye before that, who came in and just said that when Rav permits, it's only if it was a tziporin like this and not like that, and all the different details there. Then we got to a Meimar Pascal like Shmuel, and we had two answers as to why he ignored Rav's position. Either Rav changed his mind or he just didn't agree with Rav. From there, we got to another safek case with Rav Ashi, where he was lenient, but then they compared it and they said he was lenient based on both Rav and Shmuel, who would be lenient in a case like that, because you can assume there was something to be tolet, to say, oh, this must happen because he went in the reeds, and that's why he was all bloody, and not necessarily he was attacked by another animal. Then we started with this first statement, which led us to a whole bunch of other statements about the drusa needs a bedika. And then they said, why are you saying that? Shmuel already said it. And then we got to all these questions, about someone said something and they said, oh, it was already answered by someone. We have a very easy answer. Some of them had to do with drusa, some of them had to do with other treifa. And with that, we ended our daf with a statement of Rav Nachman that came in two versions, Rav Nachman's version, Rav Zvid's version. And with that, we finished for today, which was about how you do the bedika, what you have to check. And with that, we finished. Wishing everyone a good day.